Hello and welcome to India Reads. My name is Pradeep and we are reading the story of my experiments with truth by Mahatma Gandhi. We are in part 3 of the book, section 30 towards self-restraints. So let's start. I have described in the last chapter how Kasturbai's illness was instrumental in bringing about some changes in my diet. At a later stage, more changes were introduced for the sake of supporting brahmacharya. The first of these was giving up milk. It was from Raichand Bhai that I first learned that milk stimulated animal passion. Books on vegetarianism strengthened the idea, but so long as I had not taken the brahmacharya vow, I could not make up my mind to forego milk. I had long realized that milk was not necessary for supporting the body, but it was not easy to give it up. While the necessity for avoiding milk in the interest of self-restraint was growing upon me, I happened to come across some literature from Calcutta describing the tortures to which cows and buffaloes were subjected by the keepers. This had a wonderful effect on me. I discussed it with Kallenbach. Though I have introduced Mr. Kallenbach to the readers of the history of Satyagraha in South Africa and referred to him in the previous chapter, I think it is necessary to say something more about him here. We met quite by accident. He was a friend of Mr. Khan's, and as the later had discovered deep down in him a vein of otherworldliness, he had introduced him to me. When I came to know him, I was startled at his love for luxury and extravagance. But at our first meeting, he asked some searching questions concerning matters of religion. We incidentally talked of Gautam Buddha's renunciation. Our acquaintance soon ripened into a very close friendship, so much so that we thought alike, and he was convinced that he must carry out in his life the changes that I was making in mine. At that time, he was single and was expending rupees 1200 monthly on himself, over and above house rent. He now reduced himself to such simplicity that his expenses came to 120 per month. After breaking up of my household and my first release from jail, we began to live together. It was a fairly hard life that we led. It was during this time that we had a discussion about milk. Mr. Kallenbach said we constantly talk about the harmful effects of milk. Why do we not give it up? It is certainly not necessary. I was agreeably surprised at the suggestion, which I warmly welcome, and both of us pledged ourselves to abjure milk then and there. This was at the Tolstoy farm in the year 1912. But this denial was not enough to satisfy me. Soon after this, I decided to live on a pure fruit diet, that too composed of the cheapest fruit possible. Our ambition was to live the life of the poorest people. The fruit diet turned out to be very convenient also. Cooking was practically done away with. Raw groundnuts, bananas, dates, lemons, and olive oil composed our usual diet. I must here utter a warning for the aspirants of brahmacharya. Though I have made out an intimate connection between diet and brahmacharya, it is certain that the mind is the principal thing. A mind unconsciously clean cannot be cleansed by fasting. Modifications in the diet have no effect on it. The concupiscence of the mind cannot be rooted out except by intense self-examination, surrender to God, and at lastly grace. There is an intimate connection between the mind and the body, and the carnal mind always lusts for delicacies and luxuries. To obviate this tendency, dietetic restrictions and fasting would appear to be necessary. The carnal mind, instead of controlling the senses, becomes their slave, and therefore the body always needs non-stimulating foods and periodical fasting. Those who make light of dietetic restrictions and fasting are as much in error as those who stake their all onto them. My experiences teach me that for those whose minds are working towards self-restraint, dietetic restrictions and fasting are very helpful. In fact, without their help, concupiscence cannot be completely rooted out of the mind. Fasting. Just about the time that I gave up milk and cereals, I started on the experiment of a fruit diet. I began fasting as a means of self-restraint. In this, Mr. Kallenbach also joined me. I had been used to fasting now and then, but for purely health reasons. That fasting was necessary for self-restraint, I learned it from a friend. Having been born in a Vaishnava family and of a mother who was given to keeping all sorts of hard vows, I had observed while in India that the Ekadashi and other fasts I had observed while in India the Ekadashi and other fasts. But in doing so, I had merely copied my mother and sought to please my parents. At that time, I did not understand nor did I believe in the efficacy of fasting. But seeing that a friend I have mentioned was observing with benefit and with the hope of supporting the brahmacharya vow, I followed his example and began keeping the Ekadasi fast. As a rule, Hindus allow themselves milk and fruit on fasting day, but such a fast I had been keeping daily. So now I began complete fasting, allowing myself only water. When I started on this experiment, the Hindu month of Shravan and the Islamic month of Ramzan happened to coincide. The Gandhis used to observe not only the Vaishnava but the Shaivite vows and visited the Shaivite as also the Vaishnava temples. Some of the members of the family used to observe Pradosha in the whole month of Shravan. I decided to do so likewise. These important experiments were undertaken while we were at the Tolstoy farm where Mr. Kallenbach and I were staying with a few Satyagrahi families, including young people and children. For these last we had a school. Among them were 4 or 5 Muslims. I always helped and encouraged them in keeping all their religious observances. I took care to see that they offered their daily namaz. There were Christians and Parsi youngsters too, whom I considered it my duty to encourage to follow their respective religious observances. During this month, therefore, I persuaded the Muslim youngsters to observe the Ramzan feast fast. I had, of course, decided to observe the Pradosha myself, but I now asked the Hindu, Parsi, and Christian youngsters to join me. I explained to them that it was always a good thing to join with others in a matter of self-denial. Many of the farm inmates welcomed my proposal. The Hindu and the Parsi youngsters did not copy the Musalman ones in every detail. It was not necessary. The Musalman youngsters had to wait for their breakfast until sunset, while the others did not do so and were able to prepare delicacies for their Musalman friends and serve them. Nor had the Hindu and the other youngsters to keep the Musalmans company when they had their last meal before sunrise the next morning. And of course, all except Musalmans allowed themselves water. The result of these experiments was that all were convinced of the value of fasting and had a splendid esprit de corps grew among them. We were all vegetarians of the Tolstoy farm, thanks, I must gratefully confess, to the readiness of all to respect my feelings. The Muslim youngsters must have missed their meat during Ramzan, but none of them ever let me know that they did so. They delighted in and relished the vegetarian diet, and the Hindu youngsters often prepared vegetarian delicacies for them in keeping with the simplicity of the farm. I have purposely digressed in the midst of this chapter on fasting as I could not have given these pleasant reminiscences anywhere else, and I have directly described a characteristic of mine, namely that I have loved to have my co-workers with me in anything that has appealed to me as being good. They were quite new to fasting, but thanks to the Pradosha and Ramzan fast, it was easy for me to interest them in fasting as a means of self-restraint. Thus, an atmosphere of self-restraint naturally sprang up on the farm. All the farm inmates now began to join us in keeping partial and complete fast, which I am sure was entirely to the good. I cannot definitely say how far this self-denial has touched their hearts and helped them in their striving to conquer the flesh. For my part, however, I am convinced that I have greatly benefited from it both physically and morally. But I know that it does not necessarily follow that fasting and similar disciplines would have the same effect for all. Fasting can help curb animal passion only if it's undertaken with a view to self-restraint. Some of my friends have actually found their animal passion and palate stimulated as an after effect of fast. That is to say, fasting is futile unless it's accompanied by incessant longing for self-restraint. The famous verse from the second chapter of the Bhagavad Gita is worth noting in this connection. To a man who's fasting, his senses outwardly, the sense objects disappear, leaving the yearning behind, but when he has seen the highest, even the yearning disappears. Fasting and similar discipline is therefore one of the means to end of self-restraint. But it is not all, and if physical fasting is not accompanied by mental fasting, it is bound to end in hypocrisy and disaster. As schoolmaster, the reader will, I hope, bear in mind the fact that I am in these chapters describing things not mentioned or cursorily mentioned in the history of Satyagraha in South Africa. If he does so, he will easily see the connection between the recent chapters. As the farm grew, it was found necessary to make some provisions for the education of its boys and girls. There were among these Hindu, Muslim, Parsi and Christian boys and some Hindu girls. It was not possible, and I did not think it necessary, to engage special teachers for them. It was not possible, for qualified Indian teachers were scarce, and even when they were available, none of them would be ready to go to a place 21 miles distant from Johannesburg on a small salary. Also, we were certainly not overflowing with money, as I did not think it necessary to import teachers and from outside the farm. I did not believe in the existing system of education, and I had a mind to find out by experience and experiment the true system. Only this much I knew, that under ideal conditions true education could be imparted only by parents, and that there should be a minimum of outside help, that Tolstoy farm was a family in which I occupied the place of the father, and that I should, so far as possible, shoulder the responsibility for the training of the young. The conception, no doubt, was not without its flaws. All the young people had not been with me since their childhood. They had been brought up in different conditions and environments, and they did not belong to the same religion. How could I do full justice to the young people thus circumstanced, even if I assume the place of paterfamilias? But I had always given the first place to the culture of the heart, or the building of the character. And as I felt confident that moral training could be given to all alike, no matter how different the ages and the upbringing, I decided to live amongst them all the 24 hours of the day as their father. I regarded character building as the proper foundation for their education, and if the foundation was firmly laid, I was sure that the children could learn all the other things themselves or with the assistance of friends. But as I fully appreciated the necessity of literary training in addition, I started some classes with the help of Mr. Kallenberg and Sergeant Pragji Desai. Nor did I underrate the building of the body. This they got in the course of their daily routine, for there were no servants on the farm, and all work from cooking down to scavenging was done by the inmates. There were many fruit trees to be looked after and enough gardening to be done as well. Mr. Kallenbach was fond of gardening and had gained some experience of this work in one of the governmental model gardens. It was obligatory on all, young and old, who were not engaged in the kitchen, to give some time to gardening. The children had the lion's share of this work, which included digging pits, felling timber, and lifting loads. This gave them ample exercise. They took delight in the work, and they did not generally need any other exercise or games. Of course, some of them, and sometimes all of them, malingered and shirked. Sometimes I connived at their pranks, but often I was strict with them. I dare say that they did not like the strictness, but I do not recollect their having resisted it. Whenever I was strict, I would, by argument, convince them that it was not right to play with one's work. The conviction would, however, be short-lived. The next moment they would again leave their work and go to play. All the same, we got along, and at any rate, they built up fine physiques. There were scarcely any illnesses on the farm, though it must be said that good air and water and regular hours of food were not a little responsible for this. A word about vocational training. It was my intention to teach every one of the youngsters some useful manual vocation. For this purpose, Mr. Kallenbach went to a Trappist monastery and returned having learned shoemaking. I learnt it from him and taught the art to such as were ready to take it up. Mr. Kallenbach had some experience of carpentry, and there was another inmate who knew it. So we had a small class in carpentry. Cooking almost all the youngsters knew. All this was new to them. They had never dreamt that they would have to learn these things someday, for generally the only training that Indian children received in South Africa was in the 3 R's. On the Tolstoy farm, we made it a rule that youngsters should not be asked to do what the teachers did not, and therefore when they were asked to do any work, there was also a teacher cooperating and actually working with them. Hence, whatever the youngsters learned, they learned cheerfully. Literary training and character building must be dealt with in the following chapters. Literary training. It was seen in the last chapter how we provided for the physical training of the Tolstoy farm, and incidentally for the vocational. Though this was hardly done in a way to satisfy me, it may be claimed to have been more or less successful. Literary training, however, was a more difficult matter. I had neither the resources nor the literary equipment necessary, and I had not the time I would have wished to devote to the subject. Physical work that I was doing used to leave me thoroughly exhausted at the end of the day, and I used to have the classes just when I was in need of most rest. Indeed, therefore, of my being fresh in the class, I could with the greatest difficulty keep myself awake. Mornings had to be devoted to work on the farm and domestic duties, so the school hours had to be kept after the midday meal. There was no other time suitable for the school. We gave 3 periods at the most to literary training. Hindi, Tamil, Gujarati, and Urdu were all taught, and tuition was given through the vernaculars of the boys. English was taught as well. It was also necessary to acquaint the Gujarati Hindu children with a little Sanskrit and to teach all the children elementary history, geography, and arithmetic. I had undertaken to teach Tamil and Urdu. The little Tamil I knew was acquired during voyages and in jail. I had not got beyond Pope's excellent Tamil handbook. My knowledge of the Urdu script was all that I had acquired on a single voyage, and my knowledge of the language was confined to the familiar Persian and Arabic words that I had learned from contact with Muslim friends. Of Sanskrit, I knew no more than I had learned at high school, and even my Gujarati was no better than that which one acquires at school. Such was the capital with which I had to carry on. In poverty of literary equipment, my colleagues went one better than I, but my love for languages of my country, my confidence in my capacity as a teacher, and also the ignorance of my pupils, and more than that, their generosity stood me in good stead. The Tamil boys were all born in South Africa and therefore knew very little Tamil and did not know the script at all. So I had to teach them the script and the rudiments of the grammar. That was easy enough. The pupils knew that they could any day beat me in a Tamil conversation, and when Tamilians not knowing English came to see me, they became my interpreters. I got along merrily because I never attempted to disguise my ignorance from the pupils. In all respects, I showed myself to them exactly as I really was. Therefore, in spite of my colossal ignorance of the language, I never lost their love and respect. It was comparatively easier to teach the Mussalman boys Urdu. They knew the script. I had to simply stimulate in them an interest in reading and to improve their handwriting. These youngsters were for the most part unlettered and unschooled, but I had found in the course of my work that I had very little to teach them beyond weaning them from their laziness and supervising their studies. As I was content with this, I could pull off with boys of different ages and learning different subjects in one and the same classroom. Of textbooks about which we hear so much, I never felt the want. I do not ever remember having made use of the books that were available. I did not find at all necessary to load the boys with quantities of books. I have always felt that the true textbook of the pupil is a teacher. I remember very little that my teachers taught me from books, but I have even now, a clear recollection of the things that they taught me independently of books. Children take in much more and with less labor through the ears than through the eyes. I do not remember ever having read any book from cover to cover with my boys, but I gave them in my own language all that I had digested from my reading of various books. And I dare say that they are still carrying a recollection in their minds. It was laborious for them to remember what they had learned from books, but what I imparted to them by word of mouth, they could repeat with the greatest ease. Reading was a task for them, but listening to me was a pleasure, and I did not bore them with my failure to make my subject interesting. And from the questions that my talks prompted them to put, I had a measure of their power of understanding. The training of the spirit. The spiritual training of the boys was much more difficult matter than their physical and mental training. I relied little on religious books for the training of the spirit. Of course, I believe that every student should be acquainted with the elements of his own religion and should have general knowledge of his scriptures, and therefore I provided for such knowledge as best as I could. But that to my mind was a part of the intellectual training. Long before I undertook the education of the youngsters of the Tolstoy farm, I realized that the training of the spirit was a thing by itself. To develop the spirit is to build character and to enable one to work towards knowledge of God and self-realization. And I held that this was an essential part of the training of the young, and that all training without culture of the spirit was of no use and might even be harmful. I am familiar with the superstition that self-realization is possible only in the fourth stage of life, i.e. the sannyasa, renunciation, but it is a matter of common knowledge that those who prefer defer preparation for this invaluable experience until the last stage of their life attain not the self-realization but old age amounting to a second and a pitiable childhood, living as a burden on this earth. I have full recollection that I held these views even whilst I was teaching, that is 1911-12, although I might not have expressed them in identical language. How then was the spiritual training to be given? I had made the children memorize and recite hymns and read to them from books on moral training. But that was far from satisfying me. As I came into closer contact with them, I saw that it was not through books that one could impart training of the spirit, just as physical training was to be imparted through physical exercise and intellectual through intellectual exercise. Even so, the training of the spirit was possible only through the exercise of the spirit. And the exercise of the spirit entirely dependent on the life and character of the teacher. The teacher was always to be mindful of the P's and Q's, whether he was in the midst of his boys or not. It was possible for a teacher situated miles away to affect the spirit of the pupils by his way of living. It would be idle for me if I were a liar to teach boys to tell the truth. A cowardly teacher would never succeed in making his boys valiant, and a stranger to self-restraint could never teach the pupils the value of self-restraint. I saw therefore that I must be an eternal object lesson to the boys and girls living with me. They thus became my teachers, and I learned that I must be good and live straight, if only for their sakes. I must say that increasing discipline and self-restraint I imposed myself at Tolstoy Farm was mostly due to those words of mine. One of them was a wild unruly given to lying and quarrelsome. On one occasion he broke out most violently. I was exasperated. I never punished my boys, but this time I was very angry. I tried to reason with him, but he was adamant and even tried to overreach me. At last I picked up a ruler lying at hand and delivered a blow on his arm. I trembled as I struck him. I dare say he noticed it. This was an entirely novel experience for them all. The boy cried out and begged to be forgiven. He cried not because the beating was painful to him. He could, if he had been so minded, have paid me back in the same coin, being a stoutly built youth of 17, but realized that my pain in being driven to this violent resource. Never again after this incident did he disobey me, but I still repent the violence. I am afraid I exhibited before him that day not the spirit but the brute in me. I have always been opposed to corporal punishment. I remember only one occasion on which I physically punished one of my sons. I have therefore never until this day been able to decide whether I was right or wrong in using the ruler. Probably it was improper, for it was prompted by anger and a desire to punish. Had it been an expression only of my distress, I would have considered it justified, but the motive in this case was mixed. The incident set me thinking and taught me a better method of correcting students. I do not know whether that method would have availed on the occasion in question. The youngster soon forgot the incident, and I do not think he ever showed great improvement, but the incident made me understand better the duty of a teacher towards the pupils. Cases of misconduct on the part of the boys often occurred after this, but I never resorted to corporal punishment. But in my endeavor to impart spiritual training to the boys and girls under me, I came to understand better and better the power of the spirit. Tares among the wheat. It was at Tolstoy Farm that Mr. Kallenbach drew my attention to a problem that had never struck me. As I've already said, some of the boys at the farm were very bad and unruly. They were loafers too amongst them. With these, my three boys came in daily contact, as also did the other children of the same type as my sons. This troubled Mr. Kallenbach, but his attention was centered on the impropriety of keeping my boys with these unruly youngsters. One day he spoke out, "Your way of mixing your boys with these bad ones do not appeal to me. It may have only one result: they will become demoralized through this bad company." I do not remember whether the question puzzled me at the moment, but I recollect what I said to him. How can I distinguish between my sons and the loafers? I am equally responsible for both. The youngsters have come to me because I invited them, but if I were to dismiss them with some money, they would immediately run off to Johannesburg and fall back to their old ways. To tell you the truth, it is quite likely that they and their guardians believe that by having come here, they have laid me under an obligation, that they have to put up with a good deal of inconvenience here, and you and I know very well, but my duty is clear. I must have them here, and therefore my boys also must need live with them. And surely you don't want me to teach my boys to feel from today that they are superior to other boys. To put that sense of superiority into their heads would be to lead them astray. This association with other boys would be a good discipline for them. They will, of their own accord, learn to discriminate between good and evil. Why should we not believe that if there is anything good in them, it is bound to react on their companions. However that may, I cannot help in keeping them here, and even if that means some risk, we must run it. Mr. Kallenbach shook his head. The result, I think, cannot be said to have been bad. I do not consider my sons were any the worse for the experiment. On the contrary, I can see that they gained something. If there was a slightest trace of superiority among them, it was destroyed, and they have learned to mix with all kinds of children. They were tested and disciplined. This and similar experiments have shown me that if good children are taught together with the bad ones and thrown into their company, they will lose nothing provided the experiment is conducted under the watchful eye of the parents and guardians. Children wrapped up in cotton wool are not always proof against temptation or contamination. It is true that when boys and girls of all kinds of upbringing are kept and taught together, the parents and the teachers are put up to the severest test. They have constantly to be on the alert. Fasting as penance. Day by day, it became increasingly clear to me how difficult it was to bring up and educate boys and girls in the right way. If I were to be their real teacher and guardian, I must touch their hearts. I must share their joys and sorrow. I must help them to solve the problems that face them, and I must take along the right channel the surging aspirations of the youth. On the release of some of the satyagrahis from jail, Tolstoy farm was almost denuded of his inmates. The few that remained belonged to the Phoenix. So I removed them from there. Here I had to pass through a fiery ordeal. In those days, I had to move from Johannesburg to Phoenix. Once I was in Johannesburg, I received tidings of the moral fall of two of the inmates of the ashram. News of an apparent failure or reverse in the Satyagraha struggle would not have shocked me, but this news came upon me like a thunderbolt. The same day I took the train to Phoenix. Mr. Kallenbach insisted on accompanying me. He had noticed the state I was in. He would not brook the thought of my going alone, for he happened to be the bearer of the tidings which had upset me. During my journey, my duty seemed clear to me. I felt that the guardian or teacher was responsible, to some extent at least, for the lapse of his ward or pupil. So my responsibility regarding the incident in question became clear to me as daylight. My wife had already warned me in the matters, but by being of trusting nature, I had ignored her caution. I felt that the only way the guilty parties could be made to realize my distress and the depth of their own fault would be for me to do some penance. I imposed upon myself a fast of 7 days and vowed to have only one meal a day for a period of 4 months and half. Mr. Kallenbach tried to dissuade me, but in vain. He finally conceded the propriety of the penance and insisted on joining me. I could not resist his transparent affection. I felt greatly relieved, for the decision meant a heavy load off my mind. The anger against the guilty parties subsided, and gave place to the purest pity for them. Thus considerably eased, I reached Phoenix. I made further investigation and acquainted myself with some details I needed to know. My penance pained everybody, but it cleared the atmosphere. Everyone came to realize what a terrible thing it was to be sinful, and the bond that bound me to the boys and girls became stronger and truer. A circumstance arising from the incident compelled me a little while after to go on to fast for 14 days, and the results of which exceeded even my expectation. It is not my purpose to make out from these incidents that it is the duty of the teacher to sort to fasting whenever there is a delinquency on the part of his pupils. I hold there, however, that some occasions do call for this drastic remedy, but it presupposes clearness of vision and spiritual fitness. While there is no true love between teacher and pupil, where pupil's delinquency has not been touched by his very being of the teacher, and where the pupil has no respect for the teacher, fasting is out of place and may even be harmful. Though there is thus room for doubting the propriety of fast, in such case there is no question about the teacher's responsibility for the error of the pupil. The first penance did not prove difficult for any of us. I had to suspend or stop none of my normal activities. It may be recalled that during the whole of this period of penance, I was a strict fruitarian. The later part of the second fast went fairly hard on me. I had not then completely understood the wonderful efficacy of Ramanama, and my capacity for suffering was to that extent less. Besides, I did not know the technique of fasting, especially the necessity of drinking plenty of water, however nauseating or distasteful as it might be. Then the fact that the first fast had been easy affair had been made me rather careless as to the second. Thus, during the first, I took kunhe baths every day, and during the second, I gave them up after 2 or 3 days and drank very little water as it was distasteful and produced nausea. The throat became parched and weak, and during the last days, I could speak only with a low voice. In spite of this, however, my work was carried on through dictation. Where writing was necessary, I regularly listened to readings from the Ramayana and other sacred books. I also had sufficient strength to discuss and advise in all matters urgent. Okay, with this, I'm going to take a break. This has been a slightly boring chapter. It's got a lot of information about the fasting that Gandhiji would do. It starts about mm, it starts about the education that he wants to give to his children, and or rather it starts about his need for self-restraint. The Kasturba's illness had taught him a lot. Uh, he introduces Mr. Kallenbach, another person with whom he spent a lot of time. In fact, they used to stay together in Johannesburg, and he would have long discussions with Mr. Kallenbach about brahmacharya vow and the fact that uh, he felt that milk should be taken off the diet. Mr. Kallenbach also agreed with him, and there were a lot of reasons for this. Milk, the cows and the buffaloes in India at that time were being tortured, and he knew that this happened across many places where milk was being taken, and and therefore, if he was a true vegetarian, he should also abhor milk of all kinds, and this is something that was running in his head for a very long time. So in 1912, I think he decides along with Mr. Kallenbach to give up milk completely. He also starts taking up fasting as a regular ritual. He had been doing fasting all his life, starting at a very young age, along with his mother, who used to do this fasting during Ekadashi. But he at those days he used to do just in a way to respect his mother. Now he was doing not just for physical cleansing but also for spiritual cleansing. He realized that it could become a tool for him to express some level of resistance. So if people were not agreeing with him, he would go on to a long fast to get them to come together. So he realized fasting was slowly becoming an important and powerful tool for satyagraha, and it was how he could get the satyagrahis to agree on things that he wanted them to agree on. Uh, yeah, so now he comes to the second part, which is about educating the children. So as the farm kept getting bigger and bigger, this is not the Phoenix farm, this is Tolstoy farm, which is in a different place. He realized that there were a lot of children. There were young Muslim, Parsi, Christian, and Hindu children, and even Hindu girls were also part of his farm. Now, all of them were of a very young, impressionable age, and therefore he realized that they needed a structured education. Now, Gandhi was not a believer in the formal education of the day, and he had his own ways, or he had his own ideas about the education of the children. The children, of course, were working constantly in the farm, so they got a lot of physical exercise and they were in good shape. And that's what Gandhi believes, just as you need physical exercise to get physically fit, you need intellectual exercise and spiritual exercise to be intellectually and spiritually able. Now, this is what Gandhi used to do. Gandhi laid a lot of emphasis on languages. So Gandhi himself knew a little bit of Tamil and a bit of Urdu. So he would teach them to the children. There were also Tamil children who obviously knew better than Gandhi. Gandhi never tried to show that he knew everything, and he would teach them to the level that he knew and they did not. And then uh, these children became his aides whenever there are people coming from outside and needed, he could get them to translate whatever was happening in their respective languages. The language in the case is Tamil. Now, similarly, Urdu, Gandhi had an understanding and idea of all the alphabets and words, and he had a good understanding of Arabic and Persian also. So he was able to put it together and teach it to the Muslim children. He encouraged all these children to follow their respective spiritual practices. Like he was fasting, he encouraged Muslim students to fast during the month of Ramzan. This is a year where both the Hindu and the Muslim fasting festivals came together. Gandhiji observed these very sincerely. In which case he had moved to experimenting with a complete fruit diet mixed with wholesome nuts. He had completely given away dairy. He had uh, given a lot of given up a lot of things and had basically left himself with just a fruit diet, and he found that it started his health started getting improved basis this diet, and so it became a proven experiment which he would recommend to other people. Now, coming back to the education of the children, so he would teach them Urdu, Tamil, Sanskrit, Gujarati, as much as he could manage in any of these languages. He would also teach them, he would read scriptures of different religions to kids of different religions so that they could learn and appreciate this more. There was also, of course, classes in geography. Now, the problem with Gandhi was that he all had a very busy schedule throughout the day, so he would be able to teach the children only after second half, which might not have been the best time for the kids, as they might not have been fresh and active. But this is the only time that he could dedicate. Gandhi was like a principal or like a head teacher to all the students, and he would discipline them with a lot of strictness. There were, of course, students who did not want to work, who would keep shirking work. There were students who were quite bad, and a lot of well-wishers of Gandhi were concerned that that his own children were mixing with these other kids who were quite bad. Gandhi felt, however, that all the children in the farm were his responsibility, and therefore he would prefer that his children mix with everybody, and he saw all of them as his own children, and not that and not did not want to give any special treatment to his own children. uh, uh, yeah uh, yeah, so this is basically summarizing most parts of today's reading. A lot about education, a lot about how he became the de facto school master, how he used to mix subjects of literary literature, geography, languages, and spirituality. So would have been a very interesting school of our time if it was there. It was there in our time. Right? He spent a lot of effort in character building, which was two parts. One was literary training, and the other the spiritual training. So I'm kind of repeating myself here. I think I've covered most aspects of today's reading, and like I said, it's not a very interesting chapter. It's quite boring, and it does bring to light the earnestness and the amount of hours that Gandhi used to put, starting from working in the farm in the morning, to doing a lot of administrative work, to teaching the kids in the evening, to spending time on his own physical health and well-being, and spending a lot of time on reading. And he also taught all the kids to be able to cook, so they were quite independent in the sense that all the children and most people in the farm had the ability and the skill to cook, right? Yeah, so this is about today's recording, and I will see you in the next chapter very soon. Take care, and if you have any suggestions, comments, do drop in the section below. Thank you, and I'll see you. Good night.